If you spec up the M2 MacBook Air, it gets scarily close to the price of a 14-inch MacBook Pro. And that begs the question, why not just get the Pro? If you're spending that much money on an M2 MacBook Air, you might as well just get the 14-inch MacBook Pro. I've heard that so often over the last few weeks. Sometimes it's fantastic advice, other times it's just a bit ignorant. Like so many things on the internet, it's just another frustrating example of some people, not many, but some people, being unable to see past their own noses. Apple has muddied the water when it comes to the pricing of the new MacBook Air. I'm not doubting that at all, and if you spec it up, it does get very close to that Big Daddy MacBook once you start bolting stuff on. But that isn't the point, and it isn't always a clear choice based solely on price. The battle of the M2 MacBook Air versus the 14-inch MacBook Pro is a completely legitimate one for many buyers. Today, we're going to figure out which one is right for you. Before we get started, a quick word from today's sponsor, KOVOL. So you can buy the M2 MacBook Air with a dual 35-watt USB-C charger, which is okay, but it's not this. This 4-port charger from KOVOL has solved a big issue for me, which is the ability to charge more than one device on my desk at any one time without loads of power bricks everywhere. It's basically a 65-watt desktop charger that's capable of delivering PD charging to 2 separate devices via USB-C. So for instance, you can plug your MacBook in and give that 45 watts, and then plug your iPhone in and give that 20 watts. Or you can give a single fast charge at that full 65 watts to a compatible device. There's also 2 quick charge USB-A ports, giving you 4 charging options in total, and it does all of this power delivery intelligently, so you know that each device is getting enough juice. It's powered by something called GaN3, which stands for gallium nitride, and that means it's smaller, safer, and it runs cooler than most other desktop chargers. It really is fantastic. I just leave this setup on my standing desk over there, which is where I often use my MacBook Air, and it just means that I can charge both the MacBook Air, a pair of headphones, my iPhone, and even an iPad if I need to. It's a great travel charger as well. I took this away with me on holiday last week, and it just meant that my backpack wasn't full of charging bricks, which was really refreshing. I just wouldn't be without this now, and I do think it's better than Apple's option. So, to grab yours, just click the link in the description. Let's consider 2 scenarios. The first one is the base model 14-inch MacBook Pro versus the closest iteration of the M2 MacBook Air. And the second one is a fully decked out M2 MacBook Air versus the closest iteration of the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Now, both of these examples will be based on achieving the closest possible price and spec options. So let's start with scenario 1. The base model MacBook Pro comes with an M1 Pro chip with an 8-core CPU and a 14-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of unified memory, 512 gigabytes of storage, and that comes in at £1,899. The closest M2 MacBook Air comes with an M2 chip with an 8-core CPU, a 10-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of unified memory, and 512 gigabytes of storage, and that clocks in at £1,749. So for just 150 quid more, you can bag yourself the latest 14-inch MacBook Pro over a fairly moderately spec'd M2 MacBook Air. But what if you go all out on the M2 MacBook Air? What could that net you in MacBook Pro land? So a decked out M2 MacBook Air comes with an M2 chip with an 8-core CPU, a 10-core GPU, and 24 gigabytes of unified memory, and a fairly big 2 terabytes of storage, and that costs you £2,549. The closest 14-inch MacBook Pro comes with an M1 Pro chip with an 8-core CPU and a 14-core GPU, 32 gigabytes of unified memory, and the same 2 terabytes of storage. And that little lot will set you back £2,899. Now, due to the multitude of spec options for the 14-inch MacBook Pro, there are several ways to reach a price that is similar to that of a decked-out M2 MacBook Air. For this comparison, I opted for increased memory over any M1 Pro chip upgrades. Regardless, for £350 more, your fully loaded M2 MacBook Air can quite easily be replaced by a beast of a MacBook Pro. So, what are the real-world differences between these 2 laptops, and who on earth is each one for? If you know me by now, you know that I'm not about to dive into deep benchmark tests between these 2 laptops. Instead, I'm going to look at the key practical differences between them. Right from the off, the M2 MacBook Air comes in more colours. They're still a bit dour and a bit boring, but if you're the sort of person who just wants a nearly black MacBook like this midnight version that I have, that's the one to go for. Both laptops have notches on their screens, but this has absolutely zero impact on your everyday use and enjoyment of the device, so there's no need to worry there. However, the MacBook Pro screen does have nearly 1 extra inch in diameter, which will matter to some people. There's more storage on offer with the MacBook Pro as well, so you can go right up to 8 terabytes if you fancy it. But the pricing for that is typically Apple and does take that machine well beyond the price point of an M2 MacBook Air once you start adding those terabytes. The M2 MacBook Air actually beats its big brother in the battery life stakes by achieving 18 hours versus 17. This may in part be due to the MacBook Pro's better display, which is a higher resolution, it's brighter by quite a margin, and it's capable of providing an XDR workflow, not to mention ProMotion. The MacBook Pro also offers studio quality mics and 2 additional speakers, although the benefits on offer over the MacBook Air in that regard are questionable. Both laptops include the rather handy 3.5mm headphone jack and do support high impedance headphones. Chip-wise, the M1 Pro is a much more capable performer than the M2. Those additional cores and the extra 100GB per second of memory bandwidth do make the 14-inch MacBook Pro a considerably quicker machine during intensive workloads such as video editing, audio production and coding, and it does have fans, unlike the MacBook Air, which doesn't have a fan at all. Oh, and let's not forget about ports. While both of these laptops have the fantastic MagSafe, the MacBook Pro does get 1 extra Thunderbolt 4 port, an HDMI port, and even an SD card slot. The MacBook Pro can also drive 2 external displays, whereas the MacBook Air can only drive 1. So we have a bunch of similarities, some marginal gains, and 1 or 2 significant horsepower differences. But we still need to get to the bottom of who these laptops are for, don't we? So who is the M2 MacBook Air for? If you just really want an M2 MacBook Air and have the budget to spec it up as much as you need to, the 14-inch MacBook Pro probably isn't even on your radar. That's why it's so annoying when someone spoils the party right at the last moment, right when you're about to click checkout, by saying, "At that price, mate, you might as well just buy yourself a 14-inch MacBook Pro." However, they are not you. They clearly don't have that same desire that you have to own a MacBook Air. You've wanted one for ages, and for you, that's enough. Just stick to your guns. It's your laptop, not theirs. The 14-inch MacBook Pro is a far more capable machine than the M2 MacBook Air, but that doesn't make it a better choice regardless of how close those two prices get. It's also bigger, heavier, and if that power is never going to be touched by the user, it's a complete waste of money. If you want an M2 MacBook Air and have no interest whatsoever in the 14-inch MacBook Pro, just go with your gut instinct and ignore everyone else. It's that simple. So who is the 14-inch MacBook Pro for? Well, I've spent quite a bit of time with that laptop and it is a fantastic machine, but it is such a different laptop to the M2 MacBook Air. That extra weight, the screen size, the screen capabilities, and all of that performance under the hood do result in a laptop which really needs to be put through its paces if you're going to get the most value out of your investment. That's why I firmly believe that if you know you need a MacBook Pro, you know you need a MacBook Pro. In fact, if you sit in that camp, you're probably not even considering the M2 MacBook Air. You're probably not even watching this video, which makes me wonder why I'm bothering making it. But if the M2 MacBook Air is your starting point and the proximity of your chosen spec feels rather too close to that 14-inch MacBook Pro, you just need to ask yourself one simple question. How tempted are you by that MacBook Pro? Does it feel like something you could live with given your intended use case for it? Will it be too heavy? Does the idea of having more power than you perhaps need seem a bit silly? Or is it enough to tempt you into owning a MacBook Pro instead? Only you can answer those questions. It's often said that an expensive bottle of Prosecco is better than a cheap bottle of champagne, and I think that's how a lot of people will feel about the M2 MacBook Air versus the 14-inch MacBook Pro. The key takeaway today is that you've really got to want that additional power and utility afforded by the 14-inch MacBook Pro. If you don't, the pricing of the M2 MacBook Air you're buying is irrelevant. Just choose the machine that feels right. Only you can be the judge of that. If you've decided that the M2 MacBook Air is the one to go for, keep watching for a link to my full review.